The Night Callum has everything he needs, every document timestamped, every figure verified, and he still says almost nothing when she finally asks him to talk. Most men blow that moment wide open. He doesn't. That restraint is the entire strategy. Let's get into it.
The morning I finally left, the house smelled like her perfume and someone else's cigarette smoke. Not a trace, a layer. It had been worked into the sofa cushions over weeks, absorbed by the wool throw she draped over the armchair that faced the garden. I noticed it at 6:15 on a Tuesday, while I was making coffee I didn't intend to drink. I stood in that kitchen, the one with the green tile backsplash Vesper had chosen in 2019, the one I had been quietly reimbursing her for in small adjustments to the household budget ever since. And I understood something I had spent a very long time not wanting to understand. I had been made into a prop, not a partner, not even an obstacle. A piece of furniture in someone else's redesign of a life, something that had once matched the room and no longer did, and was being moved, assez slowly and with considerable care, toward the door. I poured the coffee down the drain, rinsed the mug, left it upside down on the drying rack the way I always did, the small habit she had found privately annoying for 5 years, without ever once saying so. Then I picked up the bag I had packed 2 weeks earlier and stored in the boot of my car, and I walked out of the front door of Thornfield Lane for the last time. I was 37 years old. I had been married for 5 years, and I had spent 3 of them being very carefully, very methodically moved toward this exit. And the only reason she hadn't completed the process before I did was that I had been watching. This is the story of what I watched, and exactly what I built with it. Let me start earlier. I grew up in a town where ambition was either invisible or quiet. And I had learned, by the time I was 12, that the only practical version of ambition was the quiet kind. You worked. You documented your work. You moved forward in the specific way of people who know that progress made without witnesses still counts. My parents ran a building supplies business that operated on margins thin enough to require constant attention, and the discipline that environment produced in me was the discipline of someone who cannot afford to mistake feeling for fact. By 24, I was in law. By 30, I was at Ashvale Partners, a commercial firm mid-sized enough to have serious clients and small enough that individual contribution was legible. I was building something real, in the specific way of someone who has no family money to fall back on, and therefore no margin for strategic errors. I was meticulous. I was occasionally difficult to be close to. I did not maintain relationships that required more than they returned. I met Vesper in the spring of 2016. I want to describe her accurately, which means resisting the retrospective distortion that turns everyone in a failed marriage into either a monster or a saint. She was neither. She was a specific, intelligent, socially gifted woman with a set of needs that weren't compatible with mine, and the real problem, if there was one, was that we both probably understood this and chose not to look at it directly for long enough that we were married before it became undeniable. I was at a continuing legal education seminar, IP licensing, a subject that attracts a particular kind of careful mind. The room was large, the coffee was bad, and she was 2 seats to my left. She was writing in a green leather notebook with a pen that had the weight of considered expenditure. She was 30. She worked in-house at a development company. She had graduated from a good law school with the combination of intelligence and social skill that makes institutions easy to navigate, and genuine challenge somewhat unfamiliar. She laughed twice that morning at things that were not quite funny enough to merit it, which told me she was performing ease rather than feeling it. I noticed this the way I notice everything, quietly, without deciding what to do with it yet. I asked about the coffee at the back table. She said it was worse. I said I'd sit with that information before acting. Oh, she gave me a very specific look, the look of someone recalibrating a model, and I had the distinct sense that she was adding me to a mental list of things that required further consideration. We had dinner 2 days later. She was extraordinary in close quarters. The early version of Vesper, the version of 2016, in the first months I knew her, was not a performance. Or if it was built from enough genuine warmth and sharp attention that the distinction didn't matter. She fixed on you when you spoke. She remembered what you had said before. She found the specific thing about a situation that was genuinely interesting and moved toward it rather than toward the version that was socially convenient. I found this unusual. Most people move toward comfort. She moved toward precision. Over the following year, I understood her better and liked her more, and the combination of understanding and liking accumulated into something that looked enough like love that I treated it as that. Her family had money in the quiet, established way. Father in property for 40 years, the kind of assets that compound across generations. Mother with the gentle, slightly unfocused manner of someone who has never needed to think hard about a bill and is therefore mystified by people who do. Vesper had acquired from this background an ease with rooms full of expensive things and a specific relationship to ambition. She had enough of it to want status, not enough to enjoy the work of building it from nothing. She had never built anything from nothing. I had built everything from nothing. These were not incompatible positions, but they required a kind of translation between two experiences of the world that we never quite committed to doing properly. She read my discipline as distance. I read her ease as security. We were both wrong in ways that would take years to become legible. We married in September 2018. The wedding was at a house in the country that belonged to a friend of her father's. Aldercroft, it was called, a name attached to 2 generations of the same extended family and a particular stratum of money that doesn't need to identify itself. 40 guests. Good wine from a cellar I wasn't familiar with. My side of the guest list? 8 people. Hers, 32. I mention the ratio not as complaint, but as context. It tells you something about how embedded she was in a specific social world and how peripheral I was to it. But her connections were deep and pre-existing. Mine had been built through professional life and were fewer and more transactional by nature. That distribution of social capital would matter later. The first year of the marriage was good. We were both working, both accustomed to solitude, both people who had been independent long enough to have strong personal habits. We argued occasionally, in the productive way that arrives at something rather than simply circles it. I built a life at Thornfield Lane that felt, from inside it, like a thing worth having. The second year changed in a way I cannot point to a single moment for. That is important to understand. It was not an incident. It was a gradual reorientation, not of her feelings toward me exactly, but of how she described those feelings, and our life, to the people around her. Was I found out through oblique channels, the way you usually find out about things that are being kept from you. The first signal was a comment from her friend Tamsin at a dinner. Vesper mentioned you'd been really buried with work lately, delivered with the particular quality of careful sympathy that suggests a fuller conversation has taken place. I had not, in fact, been especially buried that week. The comment was 2 degrees off from my reality. I stored it. I didn't interrogate it. I had learned early that the first signal is never the whole story, and that how you respond to the first signal determines whether you get to hear the rest. A month later, at a birthday dinner for Vesper's cousin, her mother, warm, attentive, performatively concerned, asked me whether I was still enjoying the work at Ashvale. Not in the way of polite conversation, in the way of someone who has been told the answer might be complicated. The phrasing was precisely shaped. Still enjoying, as though enjoyment were a state I might have left. I smiled and said I was very much so. I didn't look at Vesper, but I registered the question and its source. Over the following 6 months, the pattern assembled itself with sufficient clarity that I stopped being able to pretend it wasn't a pattern. Vesper was running a second conversation about our marriage. Not a lie, exactly. Nothing so definite. More like a particular framing, repeated to specific people in private settings, that cast her as a devoted and increasingly concerned wife managing a husband who had become distant. Withdrawn, absorbed in work to the exclusion of everything that mattered. And none of this had been said to me. To my face, at home, she was entirely pleasant. Warm on good weeks, a little subdued on difficult ones, but present and apparently engaged. The disconnection between the version of us she was presenting to her social world and the version I was living in our kitchen every evening was complete enough to be, once I had seen it clearly, almost architectural. By the 6th month of this pattern, I had logged 4 separate instances of information about my own marriage arriving through third parties in a form that was recognizably shaped by someone who had decided in advance how the story should read. Not 4 random comments, 4 comments that shared a specific structure. Callum is struggling. Callum is not showing up. I am trying, but there is only so much you can do. And I want to be precise about what I did when I understood this, because the decision matters. I did not confront her. The impulse was there. The same impulse anyone feels when they sense the story being told about them is not the story they know. But I understood, from 11 years of legal practice, that confrontation at this stage serves the person who provoked it. It forces them to clarify their position before they've finished building it, which is the only thing more useful to them than your silence. I gave her my silence. And I opened a note on my phone. A private note, in an application with biometric lock that I had used occasionally for sensitive professional matters. And I wrote the first entry, date, event, source attribution, what it implied. Not emotional, not interpretive beyond what the facts supported. To legal notation applied to personal life, I wrote an entry every time something relevant happened. I did this for 18 months. Conrad came into our life in November of the 3rd year. Vesper described him as an old acquaintance from law school. Different years, different programs, had barely overlapped. She offered this account in the unprompted, slightly too specific way that people offer accounts they have prepared in advance of being asked. He was a founding partner at Ridgecroft Legal Group, the kind of man whose name was on the door and who had needed it to be. He came to dinner at our house, brought an expensive wine, and opened it himself in our kitchen with the natural comfort of someone already partly at home. He was tall, well-dressed in a way that announced money through restraint rather than display, and he had the easy social manner of a man who had always been liked and had never had to think about why. I watched him with Vesper through the evening, not with the particular vigilance of jealousy, with the kind of observation I brought to everything. Methodical, unannounced, cataloging what was actually happening rather than what I wanted or feared was happening. What I saw. He checked on her without appearing to. When she moved through the room, something in his attention tracked it. When she spoke at the table, the quality of his listening was different from his listening to anyone else. More specific, more attentive. The way people are attentive to things that matter to them. Small calibrations. The kind that someone not looking for them would miss entirely. I noted it. I noted. As I went to bed that evening, with one additional line in the private journal and a clearer picture of a map I had been drawing for some time. Conrad appeared again 6 weeks later at a gallery event Vesper had organized through her network. Then at a dinner party hosted by Romilly, Vesper's closest friend, the woman who would, much later, be the first person Vesper told about the separation. Then at a drinks gathering in February that had been planned, Vesper told me, at the last minute, though I had noticed her green leather notebook on the kitchen counter had an entry dated 9 days earlier that referenced the venue. I attended all of them. I was entirely pleasant at all of them. I asked Conrad about his practice, about commercial property, about a piece of litigation that Ridgecroft had been involved in that had received some industry coverage. He answered with the ease of someone accustomed to being asked about his expertise. I gathered information the way I always gathered information, not for what it told me now, but for what it might tell me later in a different context. The private journal grew. There was a dinner at a restaurant on the south side of the city in March, someone's anniversary, 8 couples, one of those evenings where the social architecture is complicated enough that you spend most of it talking to people you wouldn't ordinarily seek out. I was placed next to a woman named Elena, a financial journalist who worked for a publication I occasionally provided background to when the firm needed context on a transaction. She was sharp, direct, and notably unbothered by Conrad's charm, which I clocked because most people at those dinners were not. After dinner, while Vesper and Conrad had drifted into a conversation near the window, the quality of which I noted from across the room, Elena appeared beside me at the drinks table. "You have very good posture," she said. I looked at her. "I mean it as an observation," she said. "Most people at these things lean. You don't." I told her I'd had a back injury at 26 and had been careful ever since. She looked at me like she didn't entirely believe that was the only reason. She handed me her card before she left. "For when you have something interesting to say." I put the card in my coat pocket and thought about it the whole drive home. I made partner at Ashvale in the spring of the 4th year. Tusse. This is the part where I should describe the celebration. The drinks with colleagues, the dinner, the specific exhausted satisfaction of something earned at real cost. And there was some of that. I came home, and Vesper opened a bottle of champagne and said every correct thing, and was warm in a way I still found, even then, capable of reaching me. She told Romilly the following week that she was worried the partnership would make me even less present. I didn't know this for 8 weeks. When it reached me, through a colleague who mentioned it in the careful, slightly testing way of someone checking whether you already know, I gave him the neutral face I had been practicing and said, "It's a fair concern. I'm trying to be mindful of it." He looked relieved. Good men often are when they've delivered something uncomfortable. I drove home, and I added the entry to the journal. And I considered, for the first time with complete clarity, what it was that Vesper was actually building. It was not preparation for me to leave. She wasn't worried I would go. What she was preparing was the account that would explain why she left, or rather, why she had been left. She was building a record, in the minds of the people around her, that positioned her as the devoted wife of a man whose ambition had eclipsed his marriage. A woman who had tried and waited and been failed. A woman whose eventual departure would be not a choice, but a consequence. A sad, inevitable conclusion to a story that everyone around her would already know. She was writing the ending before it happened, and she was writing my role in it for me. And I sat in the car in our driveway on a Thursday evening in May, and I thought about this with the specific, cold attention I reserved for problems that had become precise enough to engage with directly. Then I went inside, and I called Gideon. Gideon was a family law solicitor I had been at university with, a man I trusted with the specific trust that comes from knowing someone before they became the person they are professionally. I laid out what I had observed over the preceding 18 months in the flat, sequential way I had been trained to lay out evidence. No editorializing, no emotional framing, just the dates and the pattern. He listened without interrupting. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment, and then he asked 3 questions. When the pattern had started, whether I had any financial exposure I wasn't tracking closely, and whether Vesper had, to my knowledge, consulted anyone professionally. I answered the first 2. On the third, I said I didn't know yet. But you suspect, he said. I told him I suspected. Look at the joint accounts this week, he said. Not a glance. Actually look. Go back 18 months. I did it that Sunday. Vesper was at a friend's lunch. I sat at the kitchen table with my laptop and a cup of tea, and 3 hours. And I went through every entry in the joint current account for the previous 18 months with the kind of attention I brought to due diligence on an acquisition. What I found was not dramatic. I want to say this clearly because the drama of a betrayal being dramatic is one of the things that makes people miss it. The most effective financial preparation for a separation is boring. It is composed of small, regular, individually explainable movements that only reveal a pattern when laid side by side. Cash withdrawals at regular intervals, always below the automatic reporting threshold, at a frequency that was systematic enough to be deliberate, but irregular enough to look incidental. Household expenses logged at one figure that turned out to be notably higher, not in a single transaction, but across dozens of smaller ones, the difference unaccounted for. A subscription payment, 6 months old, to a service name I didn't recognize, for a small monthly amount that was easy to overlook if you weren't specifically looking. Each element, on its own, explained itself. Together, they told one story. I photographed every relevant statement page. I forwarded them to a personal email account I had created 3 months earlier. I was connected to nothing she had access to, accessible only from a device she had never touched. I added a new section to the documentation. Then I called Prosper on a Monday morning. He had been my personal accountant for 6 years. I told him I needed a formal audit, personal, dated, covering everything I had owned and contributed to since before the marriage. He asked me no questions about why. He had worked with enough lawyers to understand what a request with that framing meant. He called back in 4 days. There's a fund, he said, built slowly. Nothing that would have triggered anything if you weren't looking for it. Individually, each piece is explainable. In aggregate, over 18 months, it's meaningful. He gave me a figure. I wrote it down. There's something else, he said, and paused in the way accountants pause when they have found something that complicates the picture. The billing address on 2 of your joint credit cards was changed 10 months ago, redirected to a different unit number at Thornfield Lane, a number that doesn't exist. Whoever requested the change wanted the statements to stop arriving at your shared address. I thanked him. I sat with that specific piece of information. A billing address change is not passive. You have to call or submit a form or send a written request. It is a deliberate act. And the timing of it, 10 months before any conversation had taken place between us, 10 months before anything was formally in motion, placed the beginning of this preparation at a point on the timeline that was now legible. I added everything to the documentation. As the private journal now covered 18 months, the financial records were organized, photographed, and archived. Prosper's analysis was formally documented. Both calls with Gideon had been summarized in notes I wrote within 24 hours and added to the record. Gideon had his own notes. I requested copies. The pivot point in terms of understanding came from a secure file-sharing application. I had installed it some months earlier for professional document management. It was used by a specific subset of legal practitioners for sensitive records. On a Thursday evening when I was working late at Ashvale, my phone produced a notification from the application. It told me that another device had accessed a file in a shared folder. I had not created a shared folder. The file in question was not the documentation archive. But what the notification told me was that Vesper had the same application installed on her device. That application has a narrow, professional user base. You do not stumble across it in an app store. You find it through specific referral, from a solicitor, most likely, or someone advising a client who is preparing for separation proceedings. She had been advised to use it. I called Gideon the next morning at 8:15. "She's working with someone," I said. "A solicitor, or someone with equivalent knowledge. The application she's using, she wasn't referred to it casually." He was quiet for several seconds. "How long ago do you think this started?" I told him about the credit card statements. 10 months. "She began preparing roughly 10 months before any conversation was had with you," he said. "That's a specific window. As it suggests, she was advised to begin accumulating records before any formal step. That is textbook." He used that word, textbook, in the tone of someone who had seen this particular approach before and was not surprised, but found it notable. We spent 2 hours on the phone that morning. At the end of it, I had a clear picture of what I needed to do and in what order. The sequence was: complete the financial audit and have it formally dated and documented. Separate my pre-marriage assets from the joint estate clearly and with evidence. Register my professional work product with Ashvale, and then wait, with the full record in hand, for her to make the first move. I did not hurry any of it. Hurrying serves the person who is reacting. I was not reacting. Elena called in early April. She called under the professional pretext of background for a piece she was researching, and we spoke for an hour about IP licensing structures, and at the end of the call she said, "There's something I think you should know. I'm going to say it once and you can do whatever you want with it." She told me that Conrad had separated from his wife, that the separation had been in motion for some months, that during that same period Conrad had been telling specific people in the social circle Vesper and I shared, not everyone, targeted people, the ones whose accounts would eventually be sought, that Vesper's marriage was in trouble. Not as rumor. As information he had directly, as something confided to him. As a fact he had been given. He had been seeding the testimony of future witnesses. "How long have you known this?" I asked. 3 months, she said. "I wasn't certain it was my place. I'm saying it now because I believe you already know most of it, and having it confirmed might be useful to you." I told her it was. "Don't thank me," she said. "Just be careful." I transcribed the substance of that conversation into a formal memo within 2 hours. Dated, sourced, marked as oral evidence from a named and traceable informant, it went into the documentation archive. Let me describe the documentation as it existed by the end of April, because this is the part that actually determined what came next, and people consistently underestimate it. The private journal. 18 months of dated entries, specific attributions, sequential, not emotional, observational. The kind of record that shows a court, not a moment, but a pattern. The financial audit, a formal, Emma's professionally prepared account of every asset I had brought into the marriage independently, savings, a property purchased and sold before the marriage, an investment account running since my mid-20s, each item cross-referenced with dated evidence of origin. This document had been lodged with a solicitor, creating a dated record. The financial records from the joint account, photographed, forwarded, organized chronologically, with Prosper's formal analysis of the pattern and the total accumulated. The credit card statement. Redirection, documented, with the date of the change, the fictitious unit number the statements had been redirected to, and the 10-month gap between that action and any formal step in the separation. Elena's memo. And the document I called, internally, is the chronology of financial events, compiled at Gideon's direction, placing every piece of evidence on a single linear record with dates, sources, and cross-references. 11 pages. The chronology was the thing. Not any single piece, but the structure of it. The way it showed, date by date, that the preparation on her side had preceded any conversation with me by at minimum 10 months. That the fund had been built during a period when, publicly, the marriage was fine. That the billing addresses had been changed before any suggestion of separation. That Conrad had been seeding the testimony of witnesses while he and Vesper were both ostensibly in their respective marriages. A chronology argues from sequence. It says, look at the order in which things happened. Look at what that order implies about intention. Yet you don't need to prove what you can't see. You show the observable things in the order they occurred and let the reader draw the only reasonable inference. The reader, in this case, would be a family court mediator and eventually, if needed, a judge. In the 3 months before Vesper started the kitchen conversation, I did 3 specific things. The first, the formal separation of pre-marriage assets. Working with Gideon and Prosper, I prepared a detailed asset declaration. Every pre-marriage savings account, the property transaction from my late 20s, the investment account with statements going back to its opening. Each item evidenced, dated, sourced. This declaration was lodged formally with a solicitor, creating a dated record of what I had brought into the marriage independently, years before any claim could be made about what constituted a joint estate. The distinction between what was mine before and what we had built together is one of the most consequential distinctions in any financial settlement, and the way it gets contested is by blurring the line. The remedy is absolute clarity, established in advance before anyone is trying to blur anything. I established it. The second, the registration of professional work product. I had originated several significant commercial contracts at Ashvale, client relationships that had real ongoing value, built through expertise and connections developed over years. In a financial settlement, the question of whether professional contribution constitutes a marital asset is contested territory, and the strongest protection is a clear, formal, and dated record of what the contribution consisted of and when it was made. I met with Ashvale's managing partner and made that registration formal. She understood immediately what I was doing. The paperwork was completed within 2 weeks and joined the documentation archive. The third, I moved the pre-marriage assets I had formally declared into accounts clearly separated from our joint financial arrangements. Not hidden, declared, dated, sourced, moved with transparency, but separated in a way that removed ambiguity from any subsequent settlement process and made my position legible before anyone had to argue for it. Vesper said, "I think we need to talk about us. on a Sunday evening in late July. We had just come back from a dinner at Romilly's house, and she had poured herself a glass of wine in the kitchen and stood with it near the island, standing, not sitting, the physical positioning of someone delivering news rather than entering a negotiation. I sat down. She said, "We have been growing apart for a long time." She said, "I don't think either of us is genuinely happy." She said, "I think we both know this hasn't been working, and staying in it for the wrong reasons isn't fair to either of us." She said, "both," 4 times in the first 4 minutes. This was the frame, the mutual recognition frame, the shared sadness frame. 2 adults arriving together at a painful but necessary conclusion. Nothing adversarial, nothing positioned, just the quiet truth of 2 people who had grown into different shapes. I let her finish. I waited a beat longer than was necessary. And then I said, "What kind of timeline are you thinking about?" She blinked. It was the only real moment of disruption in the whole conversation, and it was brief. She had prepared for tears, or for questions, or for the slow, difficult work of bringing a resistant person to a conclusion they didn't want to reach. She had prepared for almost everything, except someone who received the news with the quiet practicality of a person who had already known. I watched her recalibrate in real time. Within 3 seconds, she had recovered the frame. "I think we should both take some time," she said. "Maybe speak to someone, and then work out the practical side together." "Okay," I said. "That seems sensible." She stayed downstairs. I went to bed. Just at 8 minutes past midnight, I sent Gideon a text with 3 words. "She started it." His reply arrived at 6:53 the following morning. "Ready when you are." Her solicitor made formal contact with Gideon in the 2nd week of August. The letter was professionally courteous and described in the measured language of initial legal correspondence a client who had tried hard and for a long time to preserve something, who was now seeking a fair resolution in circumstances she had not chosen. The financial proposals in that letter were based on a particular account of the marital estate. The fund she had been accumulating did not appear in it. Gideon's response was also courteous. It acknowledged her position, stated mine, and attached the chronology of financial events as a supporting document. And I was told later, through the correspondence that followed, that there were approximately 4 days between the receipt of our response and the next communication from her solicitor's office. 4 days during which, I imagine, a solicitor who had been working from one version of events was given an 11-page document that provided a substantially different one, and had to advise their client about what that meant. When the reply came, the proposed settlement figure had changed. The fund was disclosed. The credit card redirection was acknowledged. The framing of the original letter, devoted wife, difficult circumstances she had not chosen, was gone. The language had become procedural. We were negotiating from real facts now. The formal process ran over several months. I will not describe its granularity, which was considerable and genuinely uninteresting to anyone outside it. What I will say is that the chronology functioned exactly as I had built it to function, not as a weapon, but as a correction. It made the sympathetic narrative legally unworkable. It removed the framing her position had depended on. It showed, with dates and documents, that the sequence of events was not devoted wife, withdrawing husband, reluctant separation, but parallel preparation, narrative construction, and timed departure. Courts and mediators deal in facts and figures, but they are also human. When the facts and figures are held in a documented sequence that tells a coherent story, The human element registers it. The chronology shaped the room. My pre-marriage assets, clearly documented and dated, were confirmed as mine. My professional work product, formally registered before any proceedings began, was outside the scope of the settlement. The fund she had accumulated was treated as a marital asset, subject to division rather than a private reserve she got to keep. She did not come out of it badly. That matters, and I want to say it plainly. I was not seeking damage. I was seeking accuracy, the correct financial picture, as opposed to the convenient one. Accuracy was what she received. Conrad, I understand, moved abroad in the spring. These things often resolve themselves when the stakes become concrete. The social fallout, when it came, was almost exactly what I had expected. Within 2 weeks of the formal separation being known, Vesper had told Romilly first, then her mother, then the wider circle in the specific order of social trust. The account was established and consistent. Callum had grown distant. Callum had stopped showing up. Vesper had tried, had done everything she could, had spoken to people close to her about her concerns long before it reached this point. The implication in every version, whether told by Vesper directly or filtered through the people who had absorbed it, was the same. He left. He was the one who walked away from something good. People who had been to my house, eaten my food, had real conversations with me across that kitchen table. They told this version of events to each other without, I think, particularly malicious intent. They believed it. They had been given the shape of it months before the separation happened, by a person they trusted. And when the fact of the separation confirmed the shape, but the story became true in the way that things become true when they fit a form that has been prepared for them. I heard the account through 7 different routes over the following months. Colleagues who knew our social overlap, a former neighbor who had been fond of both of us, a professional contact who moved in overlapping circles and mentioned it in the way of someone checking carefully whether I already knew. I corrected none of it, not a single person, not a single version. This was not passivity. It was a considered decision, and I made it for specific reasons. The first, the people who had received her account had no formal role in what was happening legally. What they believed had no bearing on the documents, the chronology, the settlement. The narrative existed in one domain, the record existed in another. With Tom, they were not in competition. The second, correcting a preceded account in a social circle that has fully absorbed it does not produce corrections. It produces conflict. It gives the person who seeded it the opportunity to respond, to add detail, to reframe, to position your correction as the behavior of a bitter and unmanageable ex. And the conflict itself becomes the story. I had no interest in that story. The third, the people who mattered already knew. Gideon knew. Prosper knew. Elena knew. The mediator handling the settlement had read the chronology. The knowledge existed where it needed to exist. A social circle absorbs the stories it is given by the people it trusts. That is not malice. It is the nature of social information. The people who believed Vesper's account had been given at first by someone they trusted, and in private settings that felt like confidence and care. Of course they believed it. Over time they would form their own impressions, years, not months, through the accumulation of everything they observed about her and Conrad, and the shape of the life that assembled itself after the formal end. That was not my project. That was simply time. I moved into the apartment in early September. Serviced. Mid-city. The kind of functional quiet that turns out to be a significant relief after years of a house that was warm on the surface and charged underneath. I filled it with my books, my desk, a rug I had owned since before the marriage. Within 2 weeks, I understood that what I had found was not diminishment, but simplification. The ventilation system had a specific hum at 2 in the morning that made it easy to think clearly. I didn't mind the hum. I didn't mind any of it. I worked. I handled the acquisition that had been open since before the kitchen conversation. I took on a new client in October, a technology company mid-series with significant IP complexities. And the work on the contract structure had the specific pleasure I had always found in problems that require precision and patience. I went to the gym before work. I ate well. I slept. These sound like small things, but they are not small things. They are the foundation of functioning at full capacity. And the first thing you protect when everything is difficult is the capacity to think clearly. I had known this since I was 24, and I had never stopped knowing it. I had dinner with Gideon twice a month, usually on Thursdays, was at a restaurant near his offices that served good food without ceremony. We talked about the settlement in the early months, and about other things as it concluded. He was, as he had always been, the specific kind of good, precise, not sentimental, tells you what you need to hear without concern for whether you want to hear it. That made him genuinely valuable to know. The settlement was confirmed in February. On the evening it was finalized, I was at my desk reviewing a contract addendum when Gideon's message came through. I read it. I set the phone down. I finished the addendum. Then I made a cup of tea, took it to the window, and stood for a while looking at the city in the specific blue dark of a February evening. Clear sky. Was the kind that shows the lights with particular sharpness. And I thought about what 5 years had actually been. Not with grief, not with anger. With the particular attention you bring to a thing that is finished and therefore visible in its entirety for the first time. A completed object, which you can now see from all sides. What I saw was this. A woman who had been, for a time, genuinely invested in the life we'd built, and who had decided at a specific point that the life she wanted was different, and who had handled that decision in the particular way of someone raised to never be the one who caused a thing, to be always acted upon, never acting, to be the one who stayed. The method had been specific and thorough, and it had cost me something I can measure and something I cannot. 10. The measurable thing was time. 3 years of a marriage lived inside someone else's preparation. The unmeasurable thing was harder to name. Not my sense of myself. That was intact. Something more like the particular quality of a room you've shared with someone, the coffee in the morning, the sound of the house at night, and what it is to lose that not through failure, but through revision. She had revised me out, and in doing so had given me something she hadn't intended. Clarity. I knew, when I left Thornfield Lane that Tuesday morning, exactly who I was and exactly what I had, and nothing in my life had the fogged, unexamined quality of things left to accumulate without inspection. I owned what I had. I knew where it came from. I changed firms in the spring, as I had been considering the move for 2 years, and the settlement had made it financially clean. Westmere Commercial had been developing its IP practice and had a specific interest in the contract origination work I had been doing at Ash Vale. The move was well-timed, and the work there was genuinely interesting from the first month. Elena published her long piece in April on IP registration in commercial partnership disputes. I was a background source, uncredited as agreed. The piece was the best work I had seen from her, which was saying something. She had developed a specific angle that was technically precise and accessible to a non-specialist reader. We had dinner to market at a restaurant near her office. She asked me how I was. I told her I was well. Bemetsam sum. She gave me the recalibrating look, the one I had first noticed at Romilly's anniversary dinner, and said, I thought about it a lot. Whether to tell you about Conrad? I thought maybe you already knew, and didn't want to talk about it. I told her I had already known the substance of it, but that having her confirm it had changed what it was. Before confirmation, it was only what I had observed, and after it became something corroborated. She nodded slowly. Do you think she knew what she was doing? Each step of it? I thought about this properly before answering. I think she knew she wanted a specific outcome, and she worked toward it in the way she knew how. Whether she examined each individual decision, I don't know. Some people operate by not looking directly at the thing they're doing. They just do it and let themselves not see it. And Conrad? Conrad knew exactly what he was doing, I said. He was the architecture. She provided the goal. Elena paid half the bill over my objection, which I accepted because arguing with Elena about a restaurant bill is a project without a good ending. We walked out into the evening. She turned left, I turned right. I walked home through the park, the long way, the way I always went when I needed the specific quality of movement that allows thinking without forcing it. The evening was that clear, cool quality that April sometimes produces in cities. The light low and slightly golden, the air carrying the particular smell of the city in early spring, damp and mineral, and not quite warm. I thought about the Tuesday morning I had left Thornfield Lane, the smell of the house. The coffee poured out, the bag already in the car, the specific flat clarity of standing in a kitchen and understanding fully, at last, what had been happening. I thought about Vesper's story, the one still circulating in the rooms I no longer entered, the account of a devoted wife and a withdrawing husband and a sad, inevitable ending. The story in which I was the one who had left. I hadn't corrected it because I hadn't needed to. The record existed. Complete, dated, sourced, archived in a place I controlled. It had done the one job it needed to do, establishing the accurate terms of a legal settlement, and it would sit, as records sit, available and unchanged for any future moment that required it. Stories need an audience to sustain them. They need ongoing maintenance, new listeners, new tellings, just the constant management of what people remember and how they remember it. They require energy to keep alive. Records don't need any of that. They just remain. I crossed the park and came out onto the street near my building. The coffee shop on the corner had its lights on. A man was walking a dog. Someone was unlocking a bicycle. The ordinary small actions of an ordinary evening in a city that had no particular awareness of me. I went upstairs. I made food. I read for an hour. Somewhere on the other side of the city, in a version of events that belonged to other people now, I was still the man who had left. Let them keep that version. I had the record. I turned off the lamp.